On January 5th in the year 1949, a detonator went off early on a rocky hillside in southern Italy. The force of the blast drove rock and stone directly into the face of a local construction worker, instantly destroying both of his eyes. By the time he reached the hospital, the attending physicians had made their assessment. The physical trauma was absolute. He would never see again. The next day, a local friar came to his bedside and spoke 3 simple words within days. That permanent blindness was completely reversed. The medical documentation of that recovery is preserved today in Vatican archives. The attending physicians who wrote the initial prognosis recorded their complete inability to explain what happened. What follows is the anatomy of a healing that resists scientific explanation, an event built on the collision of medical impossibility and quiet certainty. To understand the stakes of that explosion, you have to look at the landscape. The Foggia province in the 1940s was rural and poor. In this region, a man's physical labor was the only thing standing between his family and hunger. Recognizing this crisis, Padre Pio spent years raising funds to build the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the house of relief from suffering. He envisioned a modern medical center rising from the slopes of the Gargano Peninsula to serve a population that had never had access to specialists. Giovanni Savino arrived on the hillside as a laborer, not a devotee. He was an ordinary tradesman, earning a daily wage by clearing stone from the foundation trenches. He was placing an explosive charge to clear that stone. When it misfired, the sudden blast violently shattered the rock face, sending sharp fragments at high velocity directly into his eyes. He was carried off the very site designed to heal the poor, having become its first and most shattered casualty. The trauma to Gironi's face was devastating. Rock shrapnel was deeply embedded in the orbital tissue, and the visual pathways connecting the eyes to the brain were severed. Giovanni's wife, Maria, was brought in. The attending physician sat her down and explained exactly what the examination showed. The diagnostic terminology entered into the hospital records was definitive. They recorded his condition as permanent bilateral blindness. Giovanni lay heavily bandaged in the ward. For a man whose livelihood depended on physical work, this diagnosis meant ruin. Without his sight, he could no longer provide for his children. As far as the attending staff were concerned, the case was closed. There was no surgery or medicine that could restore his vision. The following day, Padre Pio walked into the ward. He didn't perform a ritual or offer an elaborate prayer. He walked up to Giovanni's bed and placed his own permanently wounded bandaged hands directly on the worker's heavily bandaged head. He stood over the blind man and spoke 3 words with absolute certainty. "Don't worry." Days later, the hospital staff gathered at Giovanni's bed. The physicians began to unspool the white gauze from his face to check the healing of the exterior wounds. What they found underneath defied biology. Both eyes were entirely intact. There was no residual damage consistent with the trauma of the blast. The same physicians who had documented his permanent blindness were now forced to submit revised paperwork for a recovery they had no science to explain. Years later, Giovanni Savino testified publicly about his healing. He was a working-class man who spoke plainly and without sentiment. He rejected mystical language. He only recalled the physical weight of Padre Pio's hands on his head and the specific words he heard while sitting in total darkness. Giovanni would later struggle to explain why he felt such conviction while he was still blind and bandaged. He eventually described it as a certainty. He could see in the friar's eyes a sense of physical presence that pierced through the gauze. He believed the impossible promise because the person speaking it felt more real than the injury itself. 7 years later, in May of the year 1956, the construction on the hillside was complete. The Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza became a functional reality, providing specialized care to families who had previously lived hours away from the nearest doctor. While donations arrived from around the world, the physical labor fell to men like Giovanni Savino. He returned to his trade and went back to work on the exact site that nearly destroyed him. When the crowds gathered for the opening ceremony, Giovanni was standing among them, a healthy man with his vision intact. The clinical charts remain in the archives. Giovanni Savino lived out his life as a healthy man, with the sight to witness the building he helped create. Before you go, if the story of Padre Pio stirred something in you, his faith, his suffering, his miracles, then this journey is just beginning. On Life's Gold Anchor, we uncover powerful, documented stories that challenge what you think you know about faith, the supernatural, and the lives of extraordinary souls. More revelations, more untold stories, more moments that will stay with you long after the video ends. Subscribe now and become part of a growing community seeking truth, faith, and deeper understanding. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next episode of Padre Pio, Servant of Miracles. Because some stories aren't just watched, they are experienced